it relates to the role of RegTech and digital identity in financial services in APAC and beyond. And really, it's really part of the FinTech for ESG and sustainability segment. So we certainly will be touching upon that as well. RegTech is, I call RegTech FinTech secret sauce. And part of that is because RegTech allows for the inclusive finance, but also the combating of financial crime. But at its core is the issue of digital identity as FinTech expands and more of us have our lives online. So how does RegTech and digital identity have a role there as we expand into Web 3.0, metaverse, and across borders? I'm really pleased to have this really international group here today. We're joined from Australia, India, and myself. I'm in Hong Kong. So first and foremost, please put your virtual hands together to welcome Deborah Young, the CEO of RegTech Association. We have Ankit Ratan, who's a co-founder of Signzy, who's based in India. And last but not least, Amit Goel, who's a founder himself, Medici, before he exited and sold to Prove, and is now a country head in India and VP at Prove. So please welcome all of you to this virtual meeting. With this great panel with old friends and new, I wanted to start with a state of play of RegTech and regulatory compliance as it applies to FinTech. Maybe let's start with you first, please, Deborah. Deborah, could you share a little bit as to what you're seeing right now? Again, we've been having this discussion for many years. What's the RegTech state of play right now as you see it in 2022? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Well, what we're seeing is that all indications are that the uptake of RegTech more generally remains very strong. We're about to do our next data collection, and we'll have some fresh insights there in a couple of weeks' time. But we're certainly seeing more of a trend towards buying rather than building, which is good news if you're a RegTech solution vendor. We are seeing more solutions being deployed faster by institutions than we have seen in previous years. And importantly, I think we are seeing more engaged institutions and regulators, not only in Australia, but elsewhere. And finally, I would say that digital identity really remains a strong stakeholder group within my association's membership. And it's growing its impact at the moment because of the real focus on RegTech right now, including from second-tier financial institutions. But there's also a range of new buying sectors emerging, which is making digital ID a really, really hot topic right now.
Great, thank you, Deborah. To expand on that a little bit, since you're based in Australia, so are you seeing the digital ID initiative coming more from the private sector, introducing new solutions, or how's the government and the Commonwealth reacting to that? Because at least historically, there's been some pushback. Australians have their own views in terms of the extent to which they are willing to share their data with the government and others.
Well, it's really interesting because I think the pandemic has driven bigger appetite around digital identity, and in particular from the public sector and government. So in actual fact, it seems, looking from the outside in, that government are actually leading some of this work. And, it was so strongly evidenced by the early stages of the pandemic when digital identity, or the lack of that digital way of being able to say that people are who they say they are, was really, really critical in getting services and relief to people, and in some cases that digital ID was not in place. So I think the government recognised that pretty quickly and have pivoted. So what we're seeing is that the government and the public sector could in fact be leading the way on some of these initiatives right now.
Super. And I think in some circles I see you talk a little bit less about RegTech but more about GovTech, and I think that reflects the fact that it is the government that's really pushing some of this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of my predictions is that government will become the next greatest buyer of RegTech solutions next to financial services in the future.
Awesome. Now turning a little bit to the other side of the APAC region, Ankit, I would love to hear from you in terms of what you're seeing in relation to RegTech and regulatory compliance as it applies to fintechs in India.
No, I think the super interesting comments from Deborah, and thank you so much for also having me on the panel. And I think what she's predicting is already happened in India. So when she's saying that, I see government becoming a big RegTech player, actually in India, due to the Aadhaar stack, which is very famous, but there's also actually business RegTech stack. There are stacks on consent. So there are a lot of now RegTech stacks that exist in India. And of course, like the volumes are huge. You have 1 billion hits on Aadhaar ecosystem every month. So yeah, I mean, this reality has already happened in India. I think we are also at a stage where we are seeing the other side, which is that once you have a open public infra which allows for a very rapid growth of end consumer finance, you will also see risks, and you will also see things that have gone wrong. So there has been a regulatory change in mindset where they've understood that some of this has caused systemic risk, because now you have these really agile tech players using public infra and then suddenly reaching massive scale, unlike a bank which keep getting nodded on their hands every time they make a mistake and then slowly create a compliance culture. These companies scaled very quickly, and many of them also use banking rails, and of course have to use banking rails at the back end to deliver financial product, but they haven't scaled their compliance rails. And most of this compliance agreement just exists on paper, right? So the bank kind of puts the compliance burden on the RegTech, and the RegTech kind of accepts that compliance burden, but you really don't know if that fintech is actually doing it. So I think one of the changes that needs to happen and is happening underway is where the regulator has kind of laid out that the RegTech rails have to come outside from the bank. So the bank, while maybe giving financial product as a commodity, they have to kind of extend out the RegTech rails to these end financial fintech players. So the KYC, AML all have to be rails that the bank gives, which requires a technology shift at the bank side, where the bank has to become a little bit like a AWS, right? Where they have to kind of give out microservices to end parties, not just around payments, but also around RegTech.
Interesting. So India, of course, is renowned around the world for having introduced Aadhaar. So if we start the question on the identity side, and from an inclusion point of view, it really has a massive amount of adoption, which has been great. But there had been challenges too in relation to Aadhaar. So what lessons perhaps might other countries have? You've heard what Deborah is undergoing now in Australia. Might other countries have in relation to rolling out a more nationwide digital identity kind of regime, as we learn in terms of what Aadhaar has happened in India with Aadhaar?
Yeah, I think like Deborah also pointed that out, but I think fintechs would very quickly realize. So there was this instance in India where overnight billions of dollars funded companies, suddenly their business model was oof in a second. And the major issue that the regulator pointed out is that you are not following KYC AML guidelines, and the product that you're giving out to the end consumer is a product that you cannot call it a credit card, because you're actually giving a loan product, and then you're not doing the KYC AML for that product. So I think one of the new jokes going around in India is a fintech founder, he gets up in the morning and he opens the RBI website and there's no new notification, and he breathes a sigh of relief that, okay, today nothing new has come out. So I think if a guidance has to be taken, is that regulatory technology, I mean, whether we call it technology, whether we call it culture, whether we call it principles, totally get undermined when consumer tech-minded founders take over innovation. And they, of course, learn it the hard way. But there's, of course, a non-hard way to learn it, is that you keep RegTech as a very important core part of you building a consumer finance outfit as a fintech or as a tech fin.
Okay, no, well, for those of us that come from a compliance kind of legal background, we like the sound of that. We like the sound of that. But linked to your earlier point also, it sounds like in India, they're tightening it out on the so-called outsourcing of these solutions, because again, a lot of regulators around the world do have limitations on what you can outsource and what you can't. It sounds like in India, a lot of the banks had effectively outsourced a lot of the onboarding and KYC aspects, but alas, that has not been that has led to some issues, shall we say. So does that mean, and what is your prediction then? If banks now and financial institutions now have to do it internally, will they end up building it more, or will they, as Deborah indicated, perhaps buy more, which is good for folk like you?
Yeah, I don't think banks ever build, right? I think those, if there were ever days, right? I don't remember a day when bank was building, but it is always buy. The only, I think, difference is that they had in some ways thought that, we have a license and we have a payment trail and everything else will happen outside us, which is no longer true. So along with the payment rail, they need to provide a RegTech rail. At least in India, what's happening is that the regulator is also saying that everything else also needs to be registered. So while there may be licensed entities, but there should be the other entities which are in the entire chain of a financial product should also be registered. You just can't one day open an app and suddenly use an open banking API and suddenly start giving out a loan or start giving out a financial product. So at least the regulator is taking a view, okay, fair enough, you should not have a license, but you should have a registration. And there should be some rules around that registration, which are not as, because one of the other things we have to realize is that these fintechs, at least in India, there are 3 different regulators for investment, banking, and insurance. And some of these fintech players actually are not clearly one of them. They are actually doing multiple things. And in fact, there has been this question of things like crypto, right? You don't even know who's the regulator. So I think one of the things that the regulator is still not clear, where will they get registered? Who is the umbrella regulator who will register them? But there's a clear need that the regulators have set of registering these fintechs or consumer techs if they are giving out any financial product, and which should solve some of this challenge.
Great, thank you. No, for better for worse, India is not the only one that doesn't have a universal regulator. A lot of us have that issue as well, in Australia, in Hong Kong. And so there is a regulatory, a lacuna in some cases, or even arbitrage. And I think the hope and intent is at least the regulators are better coordinated, so that people who genuinely want to comply know who to go to and who to get an answer for that. So thanks for that, Ankit. Now over to you, Amit. So Amit, you're based in India, of course. In your former shop, was very involved in the RegTech space and the like. But now you've been acquired by, I think, a RegTech and a US one as well. So I think your view is much broader again as well. Love to hear your take in terms of the state of play of RegTech in 2022.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And big shoes to fill in after Ankit and Deborah have spoken. I'll try. So I think across the RegTech landscape, which we used to lay out in the times of Medici, there is development happening from a product solutions perspective across the board, whether it be regulatory change management, regulatory reporting, or let's say market trade surveillance. There's lots of new stuff coming in, but again, I think the mind share is taken by one big segment, which is digital ID and customer onboarding. And for very obvious reasons that I think post-COVID, while digital transactions grew, the fraudsters became really, really smart, and the fraud vectors have grown quite a bit. And therefore, we have to be smarter, and there's always a catch-up game that we are playing. But in that, I think customer onboarding, authentication, KYC is kind of, very pivotal, right, for this entire field. And therefore, we see a lot of mind share, market share, and everything, and the dollars being flowed into this particular segment. And what is very interesting is that there is a lot of new solutions which are coming into the space as fraud vectors are growing. And while on the one hand, we are trying to bring a lot of security, we also want to be very, provide convenience to the customer so that they can onboard very quickly and they can authenticate very quickly. So how do you find that balance, right? This is like the 60-year-old problem in the financial services or any other space. And so there are many new solutions which are coming in, which is very interesting. For example, the one that I'm a little biased towards is mobile-centric identity, because everybody is doing these transactions on the mobile phone. So For example, the approach that we have at Prove is that how can we bind the identity to the phone? And can we, if we can actually prove the possession of the phone and especially the phone number, and we can basically prevent SIM swap fraud and account takeover fraud, and then also do the ownership piece of it in partnership with companies, like Signzy and others, then can we actually provide this whole solution, which includes, everything from workflow orchestration to the entire KYC onboarding piece. I think that's helping us a lot because you can onboard customers very quickly, but you're also taking care of all the fraud which goes into, and very conveniently without the customer having to do anything. So that's where I think we are going, and there are many developments in this space. We can talk about it during the discussion.
Okay, great. Well, no, thanks so much for that. I mean, I think that is a direction as increasingly we all live with our phones, it becomes more important than our wallet. My side story along those lines is in 2020, I was visiting family in Australia, and I was getting bills for accidental roaming charges from Hong Kong because I was stuck during COVID. And so I took out my Hong Kong SIM card, and then I lost it. But because I did that, I could not do my online banking. It was all linked to my SIM card, right? So that's this downside of everything being linked to your phone, and specifically your SIM card, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how it'll soon be biometric. We can even talk about that being introduced into your put it in, surgically put in and the like. But maybe with that, I'll quickly flip over to you. Yep.
I can tell you a solution for that, but then it will become like a whole sales pitch. So I'll leave it for today.
Well, it'll become what, I mean?
No, there is a solution for that today. We have it in, we offer it as a solution. But if I start talking about that, then it will become a sales pitch. So
a sales pitch. Sorry, right. No, well, we're very open here. We're very open. I thought you said we'll get into bionics, and we'll end up putting it into the body and the like. But I wanted to briefly spin over to Deborah. I mean, part of the story of RegTech is about financial inclusion, right? And that is, I think with Aadhaar, that was how it's actually sold in term and RegTech and digital identity, right? So maybe Deborah, you could speak a little bit about the financial inclusion aspects from an Australian point of view, and how much that is part of that narrative, shall we say, in terms of introducing RegTech in Australia.
Yeah, well, it's a really important part of financial inclusion, because we would say that all RegTech solutions are adding a layer of trust, and I think that that we are seeing that there will be a greater reach of financial products and indeed fintech products that are now being protected by good RegTech solutions, and they will be aiding more inclusion across underserved communities, not just in Australia, but certainly elsewhere. And just picking up on a point that was made earlier, what is really interesting is, obviously the talk about RegTech is often about how we're protecting people externally. But actually, RegTech is now being used, and it's actually, scaling quite well. And there's at least one Australian unicorn, actually, in the area of employee workforce compliance. So this is about protecting your business from the people who actually work in your business, right? So not protecting it from external forces, but actually protecting it from the people who you are hiring that you have probably never met. And have not eyeballed in the same way that you would have in the old days. So how do you safely onboard people? How do you ensure that they are who they say they are, that their credentials are in fact real, that you have a safe place to keep their personal data and information, that they're getting the right training that they need throughout their life cycle? So this whole area of workforce management solutions. So protecting an organization from helping to give good, customer service to their internal employees, so that they can in turn serve the external stakeholders and drive some more of that inclusion that you've just alluded to. So it's really interesting times for RegTech and what's actually packed into this RegTech family right now.
Fascinating. And I thought the direction you were going to go into was using, because increasingly RegTech is also being used to address a conduct risk, right?
Yes.
So looking inwards, and then it raises the issue of surveillance. As we all now work from home, the camera watching us at home, so it
Correct.
increases lots of complexity around that.
Yes, absolutely. So where is your information being stored right now?
Yeah, indeed.
And I'd suggest it's in places all over the world.
I think that's right. In various cloud systems in different based in at servers in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, talking about all over the world and the next direction of fintech, the Web3 has become a big buzzword and is increasingly gaining traction, especially with the development of digital assets. And also linked to that then is the concept of digital identity on the Web3. Now, I wonder whether, Amit, you can speak a little bit to that and how what digital identity solutions now being created that address both the opportunities as well as the challenges of that.
Sure. And, obviously connecting it to Web2 will be very meaningful, when we talk about Web3. So I think the thing is that in our traditional world, the regulator wanted, for all the good reasons, to have KYC, to know the customer really well. And the crypto bros would like to make us believe that, let's just do it totally decentralized way. And the bad news for them is that the regulations are coming in that space. With all the stuff which has happened in the last 12 months, I think it's very, very clear that regulators are actually sort of, trying to construct how to sort of manage RegTech in that space. So what I feel and what I'm seeing a lot in the market, I was at Consensus and this was being discussed a lot, right? Identity was like the centerpiece of the discussion there as well. That maybe one of the approaches is that you do the customer onboarding and authentication and credentialing in Web2, so off-chain, and then basically you pass the token on-chain and then use it, on-chain in Web3. I think that kind of a Web2 meets Web3 solution is what we are seeing a lot, and it makes a lot of sense because there's no cold start problem. Billions of people have already been ID'd and they are authenticating in the Web2 world. So if you can actually start passing these tokens on chain and then use them in Web3, that seems to be a very, very good approach overall.
I think that seems to make a lot of sense, especially the way that we understand the world kind of works, right? And the complexity. Once you go into Web3, you can do the tracing, but again, it depends on where they went on and when they went off. And we'll segment that shortly later on to Ankit when we go into the metaverse, where we don't need to go off anymore, right? Once you go on, you don't need to go off, right? But with what you were saying, there are the crypto bros, as you say, but there are those that also believe that having centralized digital identity or just the entity in general creates hacking kind of risks, right? Because you have honeypots basically where all the data is actually being stored, right? And therefore there's suggestions being made as to decentralized or sovereign self-identity type solutions. So not necessarily DeFi per se, but at least decentralized solutions for self-verification of sovereign self-identity. So wondered what your thoughts on the current developments of that.
So basically, today, if you if you have interacted or used one of these dApps or anything, basically you have, let's say, a MetaMask wallet, and any application you are going to, you are authenticating yourself with that wallet. But then you could create multiple wallets. There is lots of issues in that structure. Even though the ownership control piece is there, but how do we know who is transacting and where is this money going, right? So there are checks and balances that will be brought. That's why I was saying, I think the approach is that in Web3 there will be protocols which will be created, which can actually receive the token while the credentialing is happening off chain, and then so you could still authenticate with a lot of confidence because the credentials have been authenticated, but then you don't have the PII data sitting on chain, right? So that's how it solves the problem of bringing the ownership control piece as well as the KYC.
Right, but I know I totally hear you there, but I guess part of it is we are still relying on certain kind of aspects of identification that are being centralized in certain sovereign states. And maybe at the end of the day, as much as anybody might like, that's where we'll end up being, right? Ankit, any thoughts in relation to some of the centralized, decentralized kind of argument there?
Yeah, I think we have to realize there are also engineering unsolved problems that are leading to this not getting resolved, right? Because I mean, first is the philosophical question of what is identity, right? So, and I mean, there are multiple factors there, but I think it is easy to understand that once I recognize Amit, let's say I know Amit, right? Whether I meet him in Hong Kong, in India, or US, I recognize him as Amit because of his physical presence, and physical presence is nothing but maybe your face, your eyes, your voice, your fingerprints. So I think one maybe commonality that exists in human civilization is that your physical biometrics is definitely identity, but there is an engineering problem in decentralization there, that unlike crypto transactions or other non-biometric transactions, which can be stored as hash and hence can be fully decentralized without revealing private information, biometrics cannot be stored as hashes. And so in some ways there is an engineering problem also underlying, which is that you'll always end up having a biometric centralized honeypot, right? In fact, like while I go to the metaverse patent, US patent, which is granted, we've actually also filed a patent for resolving biometrics as a hash, which is looking at a probabilistic solution, which is saying, okay, I'm 99% sure that you are the same, but because I've not exactly stored you, I'm not sure. And I've stored a hash. So then there needs to be an engineering solve. There is a lack of engineering solve in decentralized, and I know this got too technical, but there is an engineering problem to solve. But I think there's one good news in Web3. I think what Amit was saying is that there needs to be connection of Web3 to Web2. Like we have just got a patent for US patent for onboarding in metaverse, where we are exactly trying to do this. So what we're trying to say is that once you are inside a game and you are buying these Louis Vuitton bags for $75, there's of course commerce happening outside the physical world. And hence, if commerce is happening outside the physical world, there would be finance happening outside the physical world. And why should it just happen on cryptos? I may be a legitimate user holding a legitimate JP Morgan account, and I would maybe want to be a new user getting onboarded to a JP Morgan personal loan, JP Morgan account for crypto, etc., etc. And I should be able to do it completely inside the virtual world ever without having to, actually walk to a bank branch. But the good part is that that virtual JP Morgan account will also be linked to a physical account through the Signzy's entire journey and process, and make sure you are compliant with the KYC AML norms that would have applied in the physical world. So I think that's at least, I think something like we, and I think I'm sure other players are trying to bring some linkages to this virtual to physical world in metaverse at least.
So because of course with the metaverse, we're all avatars, which of course I might not look like that. I have less gray hair, maybe no hair, lots more hair, and the like. But the idea then is ultimately, but in your mind, I think, and that's a good philosophical question as well, right? Which is like, who am I? What is the appropriate identity? And ultimately, it is, in your words, it's biometric. It's the sum of the parts of the human, shall we say, or the human body, shall we say. So maybe that answers the cell phone question earlier on. It's now no longer the cell phone, it's my biometrics, right? So right now in terms of biometrics, which how many we have three-factor authentication right now with that. So what kind of authentication would you be looking at in terms of biometrics, Ankit?
Yeah, I think because of multiple, so there is again here a huge engineering issue. So what happened with the fingerprints and iris is that across the world devices have not agreed on standards. So like an iOS fingerprint store is different from an Android, I'm sure is different from Windows, and if Nokia is still doing phones, I'm sure it's different for Nokia. So that's the big issue. Okay, and that's the fundamental issue with like a iris and a fingerprint, that the storage standards are just all over the place. Versus in the face, the beauty is like whatever good or bad again is that the standards that were created were actually very simple and very straightforward. They were not very mathematical expressions. They were simply saying, oh, I see your face, which is eye, nose, and mouth distance. And any and every algorithm stores that in maybe a slightly different form. So it can very easily get resolved, even if you're storing in different forms and vectors. So face, at least in our view, is the most scalable one. It's also the easiest to collect. Cameras are getting better and better. Most devices, your laptops, your mobile phones, everything has cameras. So we feel, and also from a financial inclusion point of view, even basic phones have cameras if they don't have fingerprints. So as a result, we feel face is a good ID. It also exists on your sovereign ID generally. Your sovereign identity in a country also has face. So face, we feel, is probably the biometric that will become the mainstay of a centralized / decentralized identity.
But so then how concerned might providers like you be with developments like GPT-3 and 4, which actually allow for the melding and the creation and of not my real face, shall we say? And there are lots of different examples of that on the web where I can pretend to talk like I'm Donald Trump and the like.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I think that's a great question. So I think every technology will be bettered by a better fraud of that technology.
Yeah.
So that's a battle that I think continuously needs to get fought. But I think what we should always realize, which people don't realize, is that this is 10x more in the physical world. So when you're in a physical world, people actually take your papers, go to a bank branch, have a relationship with the branch guy, and actually open an account on your behalf, even without you having ever visited. And so when people try and, kind of point out the flaws in digital world, they forget that, equivalent or even bigger frauds actually exist in the physical world. Here, at least we know, right? We know it's GPT. We know you can predict, like there will be some predictability around whether this is natural, whether this is, at least today, GPT is still predictable. You can predict the fraud. You can predict that this is being generated by AI library. So there is a more centralized technology, which of course fraudster can centralize attack and scale the fraud. But at the same time, in the true open source way, once a solution is found, it can also be kind of killed in a central manner. Unlike, branches, you'll have rogue actors. How many branches will you really protect rogue actors?
No, that's fair. I spoke at an AML kind of panel, and what the regulator, who's a former policeman, said why he loves the spaces, because every time you think, of something creative, that the bad guys are even more creative, right? And so you always will have to keep on your toes to actually catch up with the fighting the crime there. So now turning over to the international, sometimes when you talked about sovereign identity, right? So in terms of right now, each individual country has it, but and then you also talk about standards. So as we talk about digital identity, isn't one of the issues then how, even if, say, for example, India, Australia works out a fantastic digital identity, right, and it works through, isn't the problem is when I fly from Australia over to Hong Kong or India, if they don't recognize it, it still doesn't apply, and that's hence it's multiplied in places like metaverse, or we'll have different metaverses. Any thoughts on how we address that? Is it standards? Is it common bodies? I mean, FATF is one, fascinating body that actually has now led to standards that in a certain way, but they're still trying to work through the actual practical aspects, right? So thoughts on the cross-border aspects. Maybe we start with you, Amit, on that.
Okay, I'm a little biased because I think we are already using the same method and same processes pretty much in about 4 or 5 countries now. We think that phone and phone-centric identity is a very global approach. It's the same exact principles and approach which applies everywhere. If you prove the possession of the phone, you take care of SIM swap, account takeover frauds, and you use ownership. I think you can do it in many countries. But you're absolutely right that the ownership piece of it is very complex. You can't easily export it to other countries, and therefore I think Ankit can actually shed more light on how ownership can actually transport beyond borders.
Ankit, he handed the ball over to you.
Yeah, I think once we are more digital, actually, it's not about digital. I think when people are more mobile, right, it's in some ways unfair to tag them to a sovereign identity in the first place. So, for example, like what happens, I'm sure it happens in other countries also, is that address proof is a very, very important proof in a loan, because people feel that, this person will live at this address. So if I have to go and collect money and there's some issue, I will go to this address. But what we have not realized that people have become extremely mobile. That physical address is no longer valid, right? There's no way you can hold them to that physical address. The same thing I think about ownership, right? The goal of FATF compliance in KYC is not truly to hold you to an ownership of a sovereign identity, is to be able to identify you if there is a fraud and then catch you. And if you think about it in a deeper sense, airports have now CCTVs, hotels have CCTVs, everything that you go through is CCTV. In fact, in Russia, actually, if you lose a wallet and you go to a police station, they'll tell you, okay, you were here, and this is where you lost your wallet. So in some ways, I believe this ownership question is a dated question when we didn't have enough technology and we were, linked to local police stations and all of that. I think today we have to go to the essence of KYC, which is being able to uniquely identify an individual and catch him, which I think, again, a physical biometric solves for, in my humble opinion. And I think as more and more countries start seeing, okay, Ankit means this biometric identity. If he does some fraud in Australia, I can, through data, kind of reach to him. I don't really need his passport number. I don't really need his X number, Y number. Today, the technology exists is to be able to identify me and catch me through my face.
Great, thank you. So Deborah, over to you again. In the RegTech Association, you see lots of different solutions, and a lot of Australian RegTechs are seeking to go abroad, and vice versa. So how do you think what do you think, if you had a wish list? How do we address this cross-border aspect of digital identity?
Yeah, well, it is a global. RegTech was kind of born to be global, right? And so
Yes.
Wherever RegTech companies are in the world, they need to be trying to solve what are global issues, and digital identity sits firmly in the middle of all of that, which we've just been hearing about. And so I would expect that there will be more cross-border activity that we are seeing, as not only Australian RegTechs who have digital identity solutions are looking to scale and grow into global markets, but also likewise there will be digital identity solutions coming from outside of Australia into Australia as well. I think what I am foreshadowing is that there will be more sharing of information, and as I mentioned earlier, I think government are going to be absolutely critical, and in fact they're probably driving some of this now, and so that is a little bit of a shift. From what we have been seeing. So I would think that our association has a global universe going at the moment, and the idea is that we're trying to get as many great solutions as we can out there into the hands of the people that need them as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, it has to be a global family. So I think that's what I'm predicting.
So we all have to work more closely together on this, because even if you solve it in one country, it doesn't necessarily work, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Accept it.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
And we're down to our last couple of minutes. I wanted to end linked to the theme of this segment, which is ESG. And maybe so briefly, maybe we'll start with you, Deborah, and then we go around the room. I know. How are you seeing RegTech helping ESG? I personally have linked it for some time in terms of reporting obligations. So increasingly, there's reporting requirements now that are coming through with IFRS and like. And so as companies need more to ensure that they're reporting properly, I think RegTech is a way forward as well. But love to hear your thoughts, Deborah.
Yeah, I'll try and do this really quickly because it's a subject that I'm very passionate about. So like you, I think it has a very important role to play. So if we just say that we agree that RegTech can solve lots of problems for an institution that will have a major impact on an institution's ability to be able to measure its own ESG impact. So if we say that as a given, that the solutions are there to help, I think what makes it really interesting and why it's a great opportunity for RegTech right now is that this is not just an opportunity for a RegTech vendor to approach the normal people that they would normally speak to at a financial institution. This now opens up a whole world, because now they need to be speaking to the climate change people and the sustainability people. And so it's actually broadening out the universe within the customer base on the different style of conversations. And because the institutions have set targets and goals around achieving some of this stuff, this is great news for RegTech. What I think is also another opportunity for RegTech is actually this whole, I think RegTech will be on a learning journey about ESG for their own businesses. So what is their commitment? So that is their firm's commitment to ESG, and how are they answering some of those hard questions about their own environmental, social and governance practices. And then last but not least, it's important that they address that, because they will not attract professional capital in if they haven't answered the questions around ESG for their own businesses. And then furthermore, if I can just finish on a point about people, in the future, it's going to be super important that organizations can answer hard questions around ESG, because the next generation of young people coming through will simply not work for a company that is not environmentally aware, does not have sustainable practices, and does not observe good governance. So I think from a people perspective, that's going to be really important going forward.
I'm sorry we've run out of time, but this has been such a fantastic discussion, and I think, Deborah, you ended it in such a great and positive way. Dare I say, I was there with the change of new government, and so I think Australia is now being more climate friendly, which is great for all of us and the planet. Amit, Ankit, thank you very much. We're talking about the planet. We're talking about the universes outside the planet, in the metaverse and beyond too. So really enjoyed the discussion. Look forward to seeing what 2023 will hold, and hopefully we catch up in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.